A tax freight train is bearing down on your retirement. To protect yourself, you'll have to harness the power of zero.
Hello there, and welcome to episode 5 of the Power of Zero show. This is David McKnight, author of The Power of Zero. Today we're going to take about 15 minutes and talk about what I refer to in the book, The Power of Zero, as the Life Insurance Retirement Plan, also known as the LIRP or LIRP. Now, before I get too far into the LIRP, let's sort of review what I call the tax-free paradigm. The tax-free paradigm basically says, or really the message of the Power of Zero is this. In a rising tax rate environment, there is an ideal amount of money to have in your taxable and your tax-deferred buckets, okay? Everything above and beyond the ideal balance in the taxable and tax-deferred buckets should be systematically repositioned to tax-free. So we talked about in episode 2, I believe, we talked about the taxable bucket. The ideal amount of money to have in that bucket is about 6 months worth of basic living expenses. The ideal amount of money to have in the tax-deferred bucket is you want that balance to be low enough that required minimum distributions in retirement are equal to or less than whatever your standard deduction happens to be in that year, but also low enough so that those RMDs do not cause Social Security taxation, because you got to remember that RMDs count as provisional income and can contribute to Social Security taxation. So we've been talking about up to this point, this whole idea that if you have more than the ideal amount of money in those first 2 buckets, you've got to systematically reposition it tax-free. You don't want to shift it all in one year, because if it's a taxable event, you could rise dramatically and quickly in that tax cylinder, causing you to bump up into a tax bracket that gives you heartburn, and you don't want to do that. So you want to do it slowly enough that you get all the shifting done quickly enough that you get all the shifting done before tax rates go up in 2026, but slowly enough that you don't rise into a tax bracket that you're not comfortable with. So we've got a lot of shifting that's going on. Typically, when you have a Power Zero roadmap, you are shifting money systematically over a period of years. It's usually 5 to 8 years. If you want to learn more about that, of course, you can go to davidmcknight.com. That's davidmcknight.com. Sometimes, notwithstanding all of our efforts to get all of this shifting done through the more conventional avenues, such as Roth conversions and Roth IRAs and Roth 401k, so on and so forth, we have to avail ourselves of a different type of tax-free tool, and that's what I refer to as a life insurance retirement plan. So let me define the attributes of the life insurance retirement plan so that you can understand why you might want to consider using an LIRP as a complement, not as a replacement or a substitute for, but as a complement. Very important distinction, a complement to all of these other tax-free streams of income. So basically, an LIRP is a bucket of money that gets treated differently than all of the other buckets of money that we've talked about so far. Why? Because it's treated under a different section of the IRS tax code. What happens with this bucket is you put money in. As your money grows, your bucket begins to fill. Now, this money can grow in a number of different ways. We'll get into that a little bit later on, how your money grows. But the point is this. The growth of that money gets treated under a different section of the IRS tax code. What does that section of the IRS tax code say? Well, it says, first of all, that you are not constrained by the typical rules of accessibility that apply to 401ks and IRAs. It says that you, for example, can touch this money pre-59 and a half without penalty. So that's a big deal for somebody who wants to retire early, who would otherwise be subjected to what we call the blackout period. So for example, if you're 55 and you want to retire and you can't touch your 401k till 59 and a half, that could potentially be what we call a blackout period. There's no such thing with the LIRP. You can touch this money whenever you want. So it's very, very liquid. Second, you do not pay taxes on this money as it grows. So you're not going to receive 1099s when this money grows year in and year out. So it's very, very different from your taxable bucket. Next, when you take the money out, if you take it out the right way, you're going to take it out tax-free. In other words, it does not show up as reportable income on your tax return. So it's not reportable income to the IRS. And even more importantly, well, I would say, also, very importantly, it does not count as provisional income. In other words, it's not going to count towards the thresholds which cause Social Security taxation. So that's a huge and important and attractive attribute of the LIRP. Distributions from this bucket do not cause Social Security taxation. The IRS is also going to tell you that, hey, there's no contribution limits. In other words, you can put in as much as you want. I tell audiences frequently, I've got clients who do $50 a month, but I've also got clients that do $200,000 per year. Very interesting. The recent article on Jim Harbaugh over at Michigan. I think it's Jim, if not John, one of the Harbaughs, whoever's the head coach in Michigan. He was recently given, as part of his compensation package, a massive LIRP that's going to be distributing almost $1 million tax-free per year to him every year till he dies. So that's a big deal, especially if you're going to be in a high marginal tax bracket like Mr. Harbaugh likely will be. So to be able to get $1 million out of there, you've got to put substantial amounts of dollars into it, which means really there are no contribution limits on how much you put into this bucket. So that's a big deal. No income limitations. I frequently ask my audiences across the country, can Bill Gates do a Roth IRA? And the answer, of course, is no. Bill Gates makes too much money. Roth IRAs are really designed for Main Street America. They're not designed for the rich. Okay. Some people will use the nomer. Sometimes people call it a misnomer, but the nickname of rich man's Roth or super Roth, that's not a technical attribute, but it does go some ways towards describing one of the attributes of the LIRP that wealthy people find attractive, and that's that there are no income limitations, meaning that the Roth IRA says that if you make more than $199,000 of modified adjusted gross income in any given year, you can no longer contribute, as a married person, you can no longer contribute to a Roth IRA. Okay, that's a big deal because if you're making a lot of money and you need to put a lot of money away, you're not going to make very much headway with a Roth IRA. It's not going to be very impactful. I joke that it's like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. You just can't get that much money into a Roth IRA if you've got lots of shifting that needs to be done, or you've got lots of income that you need to stash somewhere. So the LIRP's got no income limits. And that's a big deal. No legislative risk, and I say this with an asterisk, is if history serves as a model, there may be no legislative risk. And I share this example from a client in Cedarburg, Wisconsin. In 1963, he signed up for the Wisconsin State Teacher Pension Plan. And one of the inducements was they said that if you sign up for this pension plan, you will not have to pay state tax upon distribution. Okay. Upon receipt of that pension and retirement, you will not have to pay state tax. You will pay federal tax, but not state tax. So the guy says, well, that sounds like a pretty good deal. So he signs up. Well, guess what? The very next year in Wisconsin, 1964, they changed the rule. They said, now we will tax these plans at the state level in retirement. Well, guess what? Fast forward 30 years, he gets his first Wisconsin state teacher pension check. Do they take out state tax? The answer is they do not. They do not take out state tax. What do we call that kind of a clause? We call it a grandfather clause. So basically, the LIRP is very, very similar. They changed the rules on this bucket 3 times in the 80s. Okay, they changed it in 82, 84, and then 1988. But basically, what the IRS said when they changed the rules is they said, hey, look, there's going to be a grandfather clause here. Basically, if you have this plan in place before the rule change, we are going to let you keep it and continue to contribute to it under the old rule for the rest of your life. It used to be that there were much looser limitations, for example, on how much money you could put into these buckets. In fact, I will occasionally come across a client that got his LIRP prior to, say, 88 or 84, and he basically gets to be treated under that old rule, which means he can put in a lot more money than you and I could put into these things today. Now, when I say that there is a contribution limit, that there are no contribution limits, that contribution limit is always tied to your death benefit. So the more you want to put into this bucket, the higher your death benefit has to be. So there's a relationship between how much money you put in versus what your death benefit is. Okay, so legislative risk basically says that if history serves as a model, if they were to change the rule on this sometime down the road, and I'm a firm believer that at some point they will, simply because as we slowly go broke as a country, they will be looking in all quarters for more revenue. And I think that one of the places they may look is the tax exemption for life insurance. So get it while you can. The hope here is that if history serves as a model, if you have it in place before the rules change, you can keep it and continue to contribute to it for the rest of their life. That's a big deal, because think about it this way. If you had a Roth IRA and they changed the rules on the Roth IRA, they would likely allow you to keep whatever's in your Roth IRA and continue to distribute from it tax-free, but you would not likely be able to continue to contribute to it over the life of your accumulation period and then your distribution. So that's another big deal, is that if history serves as a model, you'll be able to continue to contribute to it even if the rules change. So some people look at this, they say, gosh, Dave, this is like the alignment of the stars. This is like all of these attributes in one growth vehicle. How is that possible? Well, you got to remember that the IRS says that if they're going to give you access to an unlimited bucket of tax-free dollars, they're going to require that there be a cost of admission. Okay. What do I mean by cost of admission? They're going to require that there be a spigot attached to the side of the bucket. Remember, this is a bucket we're talking about, a bucket with dollars accumulating within it, through which flows on a monthly basis some expenses. So in other words, you have to pay some expenses out of this bucket month in and month out in order to retain the benefits of the bucket. What do those expenses go to pay for? Well, they go to pay for a number of different things. They go to pay for administrative expenses. Life insurance companies have to keep their doors open. They go to pay your advisor. They go to pay for the cost of, and this is probably the biggest expense, go to pay for the cost of annual renewable term life insurance. Annual renewable term life insurance. What is annual renewable term life insurance? That's term life insurance. It gets a little bit more expensive every year. So every year you get older, the likelihood that you're going to die goes up. Therefore, the insurance company can increase ever so slightly the cost of that term insurance. So annual renewable term insurance. Well, most of our clients, not all of them, but a lot of them are between ages 50 and 65. So their house is paid off, their kids have moved out, they're rapidly approaching retirement. So they're sitting there asking themselves, why would I need term life insurance at this stage in their lives? In fact, a lot of them are thinking about, how can I get rid of my existing term life insurance? My kids are out of here, so I don't even need the money anymore. Well, a lot of the companies that sponsor these programs recognize that, so they've done something to sweeten the pot. They simply say that in the event that somewhere down the road you should need long-term care or suffer what they call a chronic illness, and you can get one doctor to write one letter to that effect, they will start giving you your death benefit in advance of your death for the purpose of paying for long-term care. Now, that's a big deal as well, because what is the rub that most people have with traditional long-term care insurance? The rub that they have is that nobody wants to, first of all, number one, it's pretty expensive. And there's no guarantee that expenses won't go up over time. Number two, it can be hard to qualify. I mean, you may live forever. You may have the best genes in the world. You may be on track to live to 120, but if you have a bad back, you slipped a disc, you've got a bad knee, you had a knee replacement, maybe you've got rheumatoid arthritis, you may not even qualify for traditional long-term care. This is different because they underwrite for mortality, not for morbidity. Morbidity is what's the likelihood that you'll need long-term care. Mortality is what's the likelihood you're going to die. So that's what life insurance companies are worried about. So are you likely to die? Not are you likely to need a long-term care? So we have a lot of clients that are looking for long-term care insurance, can't qualify under the traditional morbidity guidelines, but can qualify under the mortality guidelines. So they get a death benefit that they can then use during their lifetime for the purpose of paying for long-term care. So, I tell people, all the time, you don't have to love life insurance. You don't have to love life insurance companies. You just have to like them a little bit more than you like the IRS, because in the end, someone's getting your money. At least with the LIRP, you're getting something useful in exchange for those little drops that come out of your bucket every year. You're getting a death benefit that qualifies, that also doubles as long-term care. Now, I want to spend a moment talking a little bit more about the long-term care / chronic illness portion of this, because it's a big deal for folks that are between 50 and 65. If you consider that if you're between 50 and 65, and you're married, then you've got four grandparents, right? Or four parents that are likely, one of the four of which is likely experiencing a long-term care event. So you're asking yourself, how do we avoid having the same experience that they're having? Are they living with you? Are they living in a Medicaid-funded long-term care facility, which isn't always the greatest? How are they coping with the long-term care event? And you're saying, how do we avoid going through the same thing? Well, people aren't opposed to having long-term care insurance. They're just opposed to paying for it. So if you can get a death benefit that, should you die peacefully in your sleep 30 years from now, never needing long-term care, and that death benefit still goes to the next generation in the form of a tax-free death benefit, that makes that jagged pill go down a little bit easier. In other words, you're no longer paying for something that you hope you never use, because if you do die peacefully 30 years from now, never having used it, then your kids are still getting a death benefit, or your favorite charity, or what have you. So now you may think, hey, look, I don't need long-term care. Well, I will just remind you that if you should die, everything that's in your name, and let's assume I'm speaking to Mr. Jones here. Say, Mr. Jones, if you should die, everything that's in your name, whether your 401k, IRA, life insurance, what have you, that's going to go to your spouse. Okay, she becomes the beneficiary. So while we would miss you terribly, life for Mrs. Jones goes on relatively unchanged, because she inherits all that stuff. But if you don't die, you almost die, and you end up needing long-term care. And then all of a sudden, everything that you were earmarking for retirement gets earmarked for the long-term care facility, except for one house, one car, about $119,000 of cash, and what we call a minimum monthly maintenance needs allowance, which in most states is about $2,500. So what had been shaping up to be a very rosy retirement for Mrs. Jones turns out to be bare bones subsistence type living for Mrs. Jones. And the flip also is true should Mrs. Jones need long-term care. So I'm telling you, the biggest threat to retirement can be, one of the biggest threats at least, can be long-term care. And that's why even Susie Orman makes a big deal about long-term care. There's a 70% chance you'll have a long-term care event that lasts 3 years or so during your retirement. So you've got to figure out a way to protect yourself. Otherwise, you're just going to burn right through a whole lot of life savings that you had otherwise earmarked for retirement or for passing on to the next generation. Okay, so that's the long-term care piece. It's a huge part of it. I would say half of the people that I see utilizing an LIRP utilize it because of the long-term care features. Okay, it's an incredibly attractive feature to be able to spend your death benefit in advance of your death for the purpose of paying for long-term care. Really, really big deal. Okay. So how do you grow your money within this growth bucket within the LIRP? Well, there's basically three different ways. The first way is you can grow it in the stock market. You can pass the money through to the insurance company into what they call sub-accounts, which are really mutual funds. And what those sub-accounts do is you can pick, a portfolio of stocks and bonds. And that money will grow in a very similar way as it might in your 401k. Okay. So you can basically grow that money in a variable type setting where you can gain money, you can lose money. This is not my favorite way to grow money because there are some issues. If you should lose, say, 35% in 1 year, like people did back in 2008, then what that does is it actually increases the amount of insurance that you're paying for that next year, okay, which causes the drops in your bucket to get bigger. Well, what happens when the drops in your bucket get bigger? Well, your bucket sinks faster, okay, which causes an even greater cost of insurance that subsequent year. So you can really go into a death spiral if you're not careful with the VUL. It's got to be funded properly. I've got VULs on my kids. I think it's important. Can be an important way if you've got a really long investment horizon and you start when you're relatively young. But I think that at the age of about 50, I stop looking at that variable strategy and I start looking at the next two strategies, one of which is that you can grow your money in the general portfolio of the insurance company. Now, if their insurance companies are good at doing one thing, it's mitigating risk. And so they have this portfolio of investments that they're very good at growing safely and productively. That's the name of the game here, growing your money safely and productively. So you're not going to be hitting it out of the park here. This may become what's just basically the bond portion of your portfolio. But if you can get between 4 and 5% safely and productively over the life of the program, then that's not a bad bond portfolio. Okay, 4 to 5% without taking any more risk than what you're accustomed to taking in your savings account. That's pretty good. With guarantees in growth each and every year. And then there's a third type, which I happen to like for the Power of Zero approach. Remember, each of these programs have different contexts in which you would want to use them. But really for the Power of Zero approach, I really like what's called the indexed approach, which basically says that you are going to grow your money in index type accounts that mirror the growth of indexes in the stock market, only with a difference, that they're going to cap whatever your growth happens to be in a given year. So let's say your cap is 13%. The S&P 500 does 25%. Well, you're going to get 13% of that growth. Should the S&P go down in any given year, they're simply going to credit you a zero. Okay. So we've seen historical rates of return on these types of approaches, net after expenses of, between 5 and 7%, which is great. I mean, like I said, if you can get 5 to 7% without taking any more risk than what you're accustomed to taking in your savings account, that is a safe and productive way to grow a portion of your money. So you don't put all your eggs in this basket, but it can be a very compelling part of the puzzle. Okay. So when you research the LIRP online, what are you going to see? Well, the most recurring theme that you're going to see from the LIRP critics are that the expenses are high. And so the question is, are the expenses really high? And if so, compared to what? Well, so I love to do comparisons because I think math always bears these things out. If you look at the USA Today, they're going to tell you that the average expense within a 401k, and I know that people can argue that it's even much higher than this, but let's say that the USA Today is right, and the average expense per year in a 401k is 1.5% of your balance per year. Okay, 1.5% of your balance per year. What does that mean? That means that if you make a $10,000 contribution to your 401k, that first year, various people and institutions are going to be making 1.5% off of you. Okay, that's $150. When that money grows to 100,000, then that $150 now becomes $1,500. And when your money grows to $1 million, that $1,500 now grows to be $15,000. So the way 401ks and other investments are arranged is that as your money grows, you pay more and more and more to these various people and institutions that are managing your money. It's just the opposite with the life insurance retirement plan. The expenses in the life insurance retirement plan tend to be front loaded, meaning you're going to pay a little bit more in the early years, a lot less in the later years. But guess what? When you average out all these expenses out over the life of the program, it's going to average you about 1.5% of your bucket per year. In fact, the longer you keep it, the less the expenses are. So you can even get to the point where the expenses are even less than 1%. And remember, what you're getting in exchange for that 1% is safe and productive growth, and you're getting a death benefit that doubles as long-term care. So you are getting something useful in exchange for that money. So you have to remember that when Dave Ramsey or Susie Orman or Clark Howard look at the expenses in the LIRP, they are focusing on the first year alone. They're saying, okay, If I put $10,000 into my LIRP, it might not be unusual for me to pay $1,500 in expenses or 15% that first year. Well, guess what? That's the cost of admission. Those expenses reduce dramatically over the life of the program. And what we see is we'll see people that get in that first year and they'll say, whoa, I didn't realize the expenses were this high. And then they'll abandon the program right in the very moment when those expenses start to reduce dramatically and the internal rate of return inside the program starts to skyrocket. I've done the math on this. If you've read my book, Look Before You Lerp, I have a whole section on safe and productive growth where you can see that the expenses really start to get lean the longer you keep the program when you consider the internal rate of return in these programs. So remember, we're not trying to hit home runs in this bucket. We're trying to hit singles and doubles and occasional triple. We're trying to get safe and productive growth. You can't get safe and productive without paying for it. Okay. When you get safe and productive, there's a cost associated with doing that. The question is, how prohibitive are those costs? And I've done the math. I've studied these things for 20 years. The longer you keep it, the better it gets. And ultimately, it's going to be cheaper than your 401k, but you're going to be getting something useful in exchange for that money. You're getting the death benefit, which you need anyways if you have kids or a spouse or a pension. And you're getting potential, for long-term care, which according to even Susie Orman, 70% of us are going to need. So remember, you don't put all your assets into the LIRP. The LIRP is a complement to all the other things that we've recommended up to this point. I love to me, the perfect complement of tax-free investments might look like the following. It might look like, some money goes towards a Roth IRA, some goes towards a Roth conversion, some goes towards a Roth 401k. Maybe through the Roth conversions, you reduce your IRA down to the point where RMDs are now tax-free. You put some money into an LIRP, enough to get you a reasonable amount of death benefit that gets you a reasonable amount of long-term care coverage. And then if you do all of those things in just the right amounts and just the right combination, then your Social Security can also be tax-free. And if you have tax-free, what tax bracket does that put you in? It puts you in the 0% tax bracket. And I love the 0% tax bracket because if tax rates double, 2 times 0 is still 0. Anyway, folks, that is all for today. I know I went longer than I said I would, but I get excited when I talk about the LIRP because I think it's a great complement to the mix of other tax-free investments. So we will look forward to seeing you on the next episode. I appreciate you spending some time with me. We'll talk to you soon.